There is more news surrounding Michigan football's sign stealing scandal, Connor Stallions and other former and current staffers that may be or have confirmed to be involved in potential wrongdoing, and possible punishments that Michigan may receive. Much of this is no longer speculation and in fact has been obtained in a notice of allegations draft from the NCAA that was obtained by Pete Thamel and Dan Murphy of ESPN. I'm going to read parts of it to you, so just wait, but I want to give some of my thoughts on this. The notice of allegations draft and how Pete Thamel and Dan Murphy interpreted it, I think confirms the beliefs that I have held for as long as I can remember, outside of maybe the first week when I was still reacting to the news that Michigan had really elaborate spy network, an elaborate espionage network scouting mostly other Big Ten teams. I was still reacting to that and processing it. But ever since really the week following that breaking news, I've always held the opinion that Michigan did cheat, and the evidence is very clear, but it's not like Michigan needed to cheat to win. And that opinion of mine was validated in the wins over Penn State that Michigan had, that I predicted, a win over Maryland, more so a win over Ohio State that I predicted, and most analysts and, in fact, the general public favored Ohio State that week, but Michigan prevailed. And then they went on to win it all, beating Iowa in the Big Ten championship game, Alabama in the Rose Bowl, and Washington in the national championship game. And maybe I've lost many of you by now in saying that, but Michigan clearly did not need to cheat to win. They lost Connor Stallions, who I have affectionately named the sign-stealing wizard. Harbaugh was rightfully suspended for the games against Penn State, Maryland, and Ohio State. He should have observed the red flags. He should have inquired what was going on and why Michigan was able to potentially read offenses and defenses a little too well. We will never know the true effect that the cheating had on Michigan's success. And the reason I say that is because, again, when Stallions was suspended, overall, Michigan still hummed and functioned as normal. And when Stallions and Michigan were still cheating, they lost in embarrassing fashion to Michigan State. They got pummeled by Georgia in the Orange Bowl, and they looked like wet dog against TCU in the Fiesta Bowl. And one of Harbaugh's more embarrassing losses, I would say, at Michigan, relative to the fact that that team looked like one of the more dominant teams in Michigan football history. But there's two sides to that coin. As I've mentioned, I think that this notice of allegations draft, I think, backs up a lot of my opinions on this whole thing, that Michigan did cheat, but they didn't need to cheat to win, and that much of what they did was of their own merit. Now, I said much of, not all. And we'll never know. So if you don't really recognize Michigan's national championship, you don't view it as untainted, I'm not going to fight you because I don't know what the effect was. And therefore it would be unfair of me to say that, yeah, everything that Michigan did was legit, because the notice of allegations, which uses evidence of photographs, interviews, ticket information, film, etc. Also, there's a confirmation that Connor Stallions was on the sideline of the Michigan State Central Michigan game, dressed in Central Michigan gear and recording what Michigan State was doing. There is evidence that Stallions had scouted illegally 13 future Michigan opponents between 2021 and 2023 on at least 58 occasions. And some teams were scouted more than others, and one team was scouted 7 different times. 7 different times in 2022. I wonder who that team was. I think you already know. It's the Ohio State Buckeyes, obviously. So There is a lot of convicting evidence in here that Michigan did cheat. For those who bury their head in the sand and say, oh, Michigan didn't cheat, you're wrong. But I do think that for those who say Michigan would have never beaten Ohio State, never won the Big Ten, never would have even sniffed the playoff if not for Connor Stalions, I would push back on that too, but we'll get into that later. I want to read a little bit more of this and then get into some of my analysis and not just opinions, but actual well thought out things. I even wrote some of it in a community post last night on YouTube. The draft of the NOA, which is subject to change, states that Moore could face a show cause penalty and possibly a suspension for allegedly deleting a thread of 52 text messages with former Michigan staffer Connor Stalions in October 2023, on the same day that media reports revealed Stalions was leading an effort to capture play calling signals. So Moore just, in my mind, panicked, said, oh crap, deleted the text messages. The draft states that the texts were later recovered via device imaging, quote, and Moore then produced them to enforcement staff. He's accused of a level 2 violation according to the draft, which is not the most severe, and I'm assuming, just based off of what I have heard and read and what I'm interpreting this as, that Moore is simply being punished for deleting the text messages and for not immediately surrendering over his phone and complying as much as he could. I think if there was something that was damning in those text messages, especially given how the NCAA has pursued this case, they would have given him a level 1 violation. I mean, the NCAA, whether you view it as unfair or fair, they want to make an example out of Michigan. And if they had something on Moore, outside of him just deleting the text messages, which is fishy, I think they would have given him a level 1 violation. But you know who did receive a level 1 violation? And Moore maybe can, because he contacted recruits during the COVID-19 dead period. And when you have, multiple ticks against you, multiple times that you violated the rules, you can get your violation level bumped up. But that's just a maybe. Jim Harbaugh, Chris Partridge, Denard Robinson, and Stalions, all of whom are now gone from the program, are also accused of committing level 1 violations, the most serious category in the NCAA's enforcement process. The school, for not being compliant, a pattern of non-compliance is what the NCAA said in the draft verbatim. Michigan also faces a level 1 violation. And within everything that could happen with a level 1 violation, you could be looking at a massive fine, maybe a loss of scholarships. People are talking about a postseason ban. Theoretically, there may be a chance to vacate wins, but Pete Thamel himself said that that's really not going to happen. It's unlikely. Again, you never know. And the NCAA doesn't have too much power anyway. It's not what it used to be. And Tennessee suing the NCAA and straight up winning is an example of that. The draft also states that Harbaugh failed to actively look for or evaluate red flags, which, hey, he's the CEO, he's the head coach. That's his responsibility. And that's why I said that at the end of the day, and especially in hindsight, the suspension of Harbaugh was justified. But Michigan went 3-0 in those games where he was suspended. So at the end of the day, it didn't really affect the outcome of Michigan's season. And of course, Connor Stalions, he was on the sidelines for the Central Michigan game. And from the looks of it, my friend showed me a photo of the Western Michigan sidelines against Michigan State in 2022. And there's someone on that sidelines who looks awfully familiar to Connor Stalions. But you know what? There's already enough evidence. It wouldn't really matter if Stalions was revealed to be on the sidelines of Western Michigan against Michigan State when you already caught him scouting illegally 13 other teams, 58 occasions, guiding that, manipulating interns and at least one full-time staffer into believing what they were doing was okay, and all this other stuff. It really doesn't look good for Michigan. It doesn't. And especially in terms of being, quote unquote, the leaders and the best. It does not look good on that front. But in my view, that's about it. I mean, What else? What else is there? What other punishments? What other negativity? There's not much. Moore may face a suspension, but he could also not face a suspension. And it's not like he's talked about in being fired. He's not in that conversation. And he's accused of committing a level 2 violation. A suspension is the worst he'll face, and he may not face one. Jim Harbaugh, Chris Partridge, Denard Robinson, and Connor Stalions are staffers that will have a much harder time seeking future employment and have their reputation in the coaching world and in the NCAA and college football world perhaps permanently damaged. Denard Robinson was fired for a drunk driving incident from Michigan earlier this preseason. Partridge was fired last fall for failing to comply with the NCAA. Stalions obviously resigned right after the news broke, basically. And Jim Harbaugh left for the Los Angeles Chargers in January of 2024, nearly half a year ago. If Harbaugh wanted to return to college football, he'd be assumed as guilty until proven innocent, which is basically what a show cause penalty is, and whoever wants to hire him would have to provide substantial proof to the NCAA that he deserves to coach again. And that would be a very difficult process. And Connor Stalions, well, he's not doing anything else in the realm of college football. At least I don't expect him to be. I don't think that if you look at, let's say, what Mel Tucker did versus what Connor Stalions did, that on a moral level of things, that those are the same thing. But in the world of college football, like only looking at college football and what athletic directors and head coaches who want to win see, it's probably amounts to the same thing. Something egregious in the college football world, so they'll, at the very best, be hired as analysts somewhere. The very worst, they may never coach again. And for Tucker, especially, as an example, and Stalions, of course, actions face consequences. The good news for Michigan is that I think severe punishment is unlikely. And here's why. Moore being accused of a level 2 violation, no talk about vacating wins, the national championship, the NCAA president saying at the national championship game that Michigan won it fair and square, and the lack of power that the NCAA has. All of that works in Michigan's favor. Michigan's reputation is absolutely tainted, and that may be Michigan's biggest loss, and a big loss for a university, especially under Harbaugh, that's always touted that, you know, being a Michigan man is being of integrity and of all these other things, and that doesn't look so good when, from 2021 to 2023, your most successful seasons under your leadership for Jim Harbaugh, and Michigan's most successful run as a program, perhaps ever, most dominant run for sure, outside of the point-a-minute teams, it doesn't look good. It really doesn't. There is definitely an argument, a strong one, for that Michigan seasons to a certain degree from 21 to 23 are tainted, especially the 2021 and 2022 seasons where Michigan wasn't caught and they didn't face any punishment. At least last year in 2023, they only illegally scouted, from what I understand, at least the illegal scouting that mattered, teams that they would have beaten anyway by double digits. And by the time they played Penn State, by the time they played Ohio State, the fact that those teams had some time to adjust their signs, that Stalions and Michigan no longer had the cheat sheet. Stalions was no longer there, and you have a penalty to kind of even out things with Harbaugh being suspended, and Michigan still won those games and then won it all and won the playoff. At least that season is a little less tainted than the other two, but still, it doesn't look good. And that's really the bad news, is that Michigan isn't innocent, and there are going to be some type of smaller punishments, I would imagine, whether that is fines or maybe a suspension. Maybe none of that happens, but I don't think that Michigan is as likely to fight any potential small punishments like, let's say, Tennessee. In my view, they would be more likely on the side of like Florida State when it comes to solving these problems than the side of Tennessee. Florida State accepting the penalties that the NCAA provided, Tennessee just outright saying, nope, screw you, doesn't matter. And finally, I want to look at Michigan and their performance from 2020 to 2023. And the reason I want to do that is to make a case for what I said earlier, that the cheating mattered, and that's basically what this whole video has been talking about, is that Michigan did cheat. Hear me again. Put on your thinking cap and open up your ears. Michigan cheated. They did. They straight up cheated, and take from that what you will. And they did have some type of advantage over most other teams that they played. Those are facts. However, both things can be true. Both things can be true. That Michigan cheated, but that Michigan's wins in the 2021 through 2023 period were not flukes. In fact, very far from it. Now, how can you say that? They went from being 2-4 in 2020 with almost a touchdown loss per game margin of defeat to in 2021 nearly winning on average by 3 touchdowns every game, then about 3.5 touchdowns every game, or 3 touchdowns and a field goal in 2022 and 2023. How can you say that, Sam? Well, here's how I can say it. Number one, COVID was a disaster, not just for Michigan, but for Penn State, for Minnesota, for Wisconsin, for many teams that were expected to be better than they actually were, particularly in the Big Ten. I mean, for goodness sakes, Scott Frost got his second greatest win in his Nebraska tenure by beating a winless Penn State team. A Penn State team that in a regular season, if Micah Parsons doesn't opt out and there's crowd noise, probably ends up being overrated compared to their preseason top 10 ranking, but they'd go to a bowl game. They'd probably have a winning conference record. You probably don't lose to Maryland, and you don't lose to Nebraska. At least I would think so. And then Penn State improved the following year in 2021, and they looked good for a brief time period before Clifford got injured. Iowa got in their heads and just really destroyed them for how close that game was, and their season fell apart. Michigan State had their worst season in ages in 2020, then bounced back big time in 2021. And there are other examples of this, like Minnesota, Wisconsin. I mean, all in all, college football defenses got a lot better from 2020 to 2021, because in the 2020 preseason, there was really a lot of no contact rules to keep players safe from COVID, because people didn't know a lot about COVID yet, and people thought that COVID was a lot more dangerous than it turned out to be, and understandably so. So there were different rules in place that did not benefit defenses. The rules went to the detriment of defenses, and Michigan, being a defensively led team who had a defensive coordinator in Don Brown that was on the way out, who was being figured out more and more every year by every team in the Big Ten, everything just combined into being a disastrous season for Michigan. Michigan didn't even return 50% of their production entering 2020 as well. So they were a young team, an experienced team. Everything came together for a disastrous season for Michigan. A very poor coached team, a team that was not prepared, that didn't really know how to face adversity and overcome it outside of that Rutgers game. But then entering 2021, Michigan had staff upgrades, bringing in Mike McDonald. Michigan promoted Sharon Moore, put him on the offensive line position, and had him inputting some play calling ideas and some schemes as well. Harbaugh took more control over the offense and brought Michigan back to more of a ground and pound system, his bread and butter. And from there, with more experience, better coaches, fans in the stands, and at a school like Michigan who has a large stadium like the Big House, their home field advantage is one of the better home field advantages in all of college football. And they started off with several home games, gave Michigan some momentum, some juice, Cade McNamara was a better quarterback than Joe Milton, and this time they started the best quarterback that they had from the beginning of the year rather than waiting until after a few blowout losses and embarrassing performances to fix that. And a lot of things went right. There's also Steve Klinkscale being hired to coach the secondary, and immediately the secondary was so much better. I mean, even look at Vincent Gray. Vincent Gray went from being atrocious to being a good defensive back. That's coaching. Same on the offensive line. The offensive line improved. Same with tight end. The running backs dramatically improved with Mike Hart as the running backs coach. So there were legitimate things that Michigan did to become great, to be now an elite team, an elite program. Over the past 3 seasons, the second best program in college football, only behind Georgia, who's been the only school to win more national championships, win more games, and have a higher winning percentage than Michigan post-COVID, post the 2020 season. So you look at that, and then you look at the fact that in 2021 and 2022, Ohio State's defense was not up to standard, because it's really the Ohio State game that a lot of people are talking about in regards to this whole cheating scandal, and that's understandable. But if you're going to do that, talk about 2021 Penn State, where Michigan won by 1 score. Talk about that. Talk about 2022 Illinois, where Michigan won again by 1 score, and they trailed Illinois for a good chunk of the second half. In fact, I would argue that Michigan's success in 2022 was greater assisted by a bad no call against Illinois than the sign stealing. Maybe that's a bold opinion of mine, but that was an atrocious offensive pass interference. It's basically Michigan wide receiver goes on a blocking route, I guess, a false route, and just trucks this Illinois defensive back, just shoves him over. That at least can be disputed as an offensive pass interference call. And it wasn't. And Michigan won and went 11-0 entering the Ohio State game on the road. And whether you want to talk about Ohio State's inability to defend competent offenses in 2021, whether it's Penn State with no ground game able to score 24 points on them, whether it's Adrian Martinez and Nebraska and Ramir Johnson and an offensive line that wasn't really that good, and Samari Toure just torching that defense when they just needed to get back in the game, whether it's Minnesota running for a bajillion yards on them before Ibrahim got hurt, whether it's Mario Cristobal coming in to the shoe and just saying, hold my beer, I'm going to run CJ Verdell over and over and over again and mix in Travis Dye and Anthony Brown and kill you, and your defense can't do anything about it. Or whether it's Utah in the Rose Bowl. I know there were opt-outs in that game, but Utah hung 45 points, and I think that may have been a season high or the most points that Utah scored against a top 15 or top 10 team since they had Travis Wilson and scored over 60 on Oregon in 2015. I could be wrong on that. That's just a guess, but intuition says that was the case. Ohio State's defense in 2021 wasn't good, and Michigan ran on them, and Michigan annihilated them with a rushing attack that was shown to be good over and over and over again, year over year over year. Connor Stallions did not cause Ryan Day to run Travion Henderson for 3 times in a row at the start of the second quarter, acting like Travion Henderson was J.K. Dobbins and could just power through for extra yardage. He was a true freshman behind an offensive line that struggled compared to previous Ryan Day and even Urban Meyer offensive lines at creating consistently dominant rushing attacks. It wasn't Connor Stalions' fault or his doing that Ohio State had a special teams error at the kickoff that they received in 2021 for their first drive that pinned them inside the 5, and with the snow and with a difficult situation, Stroud could not complete a pass, could not pick up a first down, and they punted back to Michigan, and thankfully Bryson Shaw picked off Cade McNamara and prevented Michigan from going up 14-0 early. And then, if not for that, maybe we're talking about a 52 to 27 Michigan victory, which would be insane. But that just shows that Ohio State's defense that year wasn't that good. They weren't. Not one bit. In 2022, their defense was better, but they struggled with consistently making tackles, and they struggled in one-on-one coverage. And Jim Knowles' more aggressive scheme in 2022 compared to his more conservative scheme in 2023 killed that secondary. Do you want to know why Ohio State was down to Penn State? Measly, James Franklin-led Penn State? Not actually, but just from the perspective of Michigan and Ohio State, who've dominated Penn State, especially in the last 3 seasons, and overall in the entire James Franklin era. Why was Penn State leading Ohio State? Why was the same Penn State team that got blitzed 41-17 against Michigan, and heck, maybe sign stealing had something to do with that. Let's at least, let that possibility float out in the air. Why did Penn State, who lost to Michigan, got blown out, who allowed Minnesota to hang around for a half, who at other times, like against Purdue, for example, Purdue hung 24 offensive points on Penn State in 3 quarters. And now, Ohio State is kicking field goals, can't score touchdowns in the red zone to save their life. Penn State's up 21-16. And Penn State had no sign-stealing edge. But you know what Penn State did have? What they had is they had Parker Washington and they had Katron Allen. And they had a tough offensive line that wasn't elite. It wasn't as good as Ohio State's or Michigan's that year, or not even as good as Georgia's. Probably not as good as TCU's. But it was tough. It was gritty. And Katron Allen is basically Hassan Haskins in a Penn State uniform. Ohio State could not neuter him. And he was able to keep that defense honest. And with screen passes, with comeback routes, with Parker Washington making amazing catches on seams, or Theo Johnson, Penn State was able to put together drives and go down the field. And Penn State's first touchdown of that game was eerily similar to Michigan's first touchdown against Ohio State. It was a short route meant to pick up a first down, 6 yards for Penn State, 9 yards for Michigan, and Ohio State's defensive backs couldn't tackle Parker Washington. He went to the end zone. And Ohio State's defensive backs couldn't tackle Cornelius Johnson, and he went to the end zone. And Ohio State couldn't neuter Michigan's rushing attack. They did early, but in the second half, Michigan did just enough to keep that defense honest. And eventually, they went down and they took the lead late in the third quarter. Well, it was actually a little earlier than that, but that's really when they took the lead in the third quarter initially, but then when they extended the lead to double digits in the fourth quarter, that's when you thought, oh no, Ohio State is probably in trouble here. And against Penn State on the road, when Penn State converted that 4th and goal with Katron Allen, some people probably thought, oh no, Ohio State may be in trouble. And for the 2023 game, it's pretty simple. Jim Harbaugh wasn't there. Ryan Day was. Michigan suffered injuries. Stallions wasn't there. And Ohio State played a great game. I thought they played a better game than Michigan did, but Michigan at that point just had the better team. They had the more X-factor players. They were better at every position compared to Ohio State except for wide receiver and maybe safety, where Michigan suffered some injuries. And even though Ohio State suffered injuries as well, they had Josh Proctor, who was one of their better defensive backs last year. And hopefully he has success in the NFL. So that's really my opinion on all of this is, yes, Michigan cheated. They absolutely cheated. But at the same time, how much of an effect did it have? We don't know. We do not know what effect it had. We know it had some effect. We know that for sure. But ultimately, especially when considering that Stallions was suspended and then Michigan still went on to win it all, you can't seriously think to yourself that Michigan never wins the Big Ten, that they never beat Ohio State, if not for some sign-stealing wizard who wrote an insane manifesto about one day being the head coach at Michigan. I just don't think that's reasonable to think. I could be wrong, but I don't think I am. Just like how maybe there's a chance that I could be wrong on how much I'm saying Michigan is guilty, but I don't think I am. I think the chances that I'm wrong on both of those fronts are extremely small. And as for Michigan, 18.4 points, not points per game, but 18.4 average point margin per game, plus 18.4, plus 24.4 average point margin per game in 2022, and a plus 25.5 average point margin per game in 2023. That's consistency. Michigan beat Penn State by 9. They beat Maryland by 7. They beat Ohio State by 6. Iowa by 26. They beat Alabama by 7 in overtime. And they beat Washington, who was just excellent at winning close games. They beat them and dominated them by 21 points. And Penn State, Ohio State, Alabama, and Washington, those were all top 10 teams at the end of the season. And if you look at power rankings, those were all top 7, top 6 teams outside of Washington, but I think that power ratings really undervalued Washington in any way. When you win that many close games and you game control Oregon to death twice, you are an exception to the rule. You just are. At that point, your close wins are no longer detriments. They're just an example that you can just do that. You can win close games, and for you, it's sustainable. But that's all I have to say in this video. I've talked for long enough. Thank you all so much for watching this video. Please remember to hit that subscribe button, click the notification bell, like this video, and comment your thoughts down below. Thanks to Crash2488 and Brasco Rascal for being Heisman members and sponsoring this video and channel. Check out my Patreon page if you want to support the channel via the link in the description or the pinned comment. Thanks to Chris Lane, Connor OH, and Ismar for being All-American members. Thanks to John Lynn, Roaming Gnome, Matthew Sale, Austin Christmas, and Janisha Cockrell for being all-conference members. And another thing you can do to support the channel is purchase merchandise on my merchandise store via the link in the description or down below in the pinned comment. Same as the Patreon page. The t-shirts, the sweater, which you saw me wear the sweater in today's video, they're all extremely comfortable. You can get a black or a white t-shirt or t-shirts of each Big Ten school color. So there's 18 of those that you can get. They're all very comfortable. There's a black or white t-shirt, black or white long sleeve shirt, black or white sweatshirt, sweater. There's even a College Football with Sam mug if that's your thing. I encourage you to check out my merchandise store. Thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you guys soon. Bye-bye.